Purpose of this meeting is to discuss the 2019 performance audit and the subsequent recommendations that were made by the Department of the Auditor General. Members, we're going to go this route on the agenda. We're going to hear first from the Director of the Game and Fisheries Committee. Then we will go straight to members for questions, comments, etc. The chairs will reserve any questions and comments for the end after we hear from any members. Okay, and then we will get started. Director, if you would introduce yourself. Oh, sorry, I apologize. Roll call.
Chair Kulik.
Here.
Rep Boyd.
Leave.
Rep Ceresi.
He's here.
Online.
Good morning, Rep.
Rep DeLoso.
Leave.
Rep Friel.
Here.
Rep Gergley.
Leave.
Rep Garrell.
Leave.
Rep Haddock.
Here.
Rep Hohenstein.
Here.
Rep Kazim.
Leave.
Rep McNeil. Rep Mirsky.
Leave.
Rep Paelli. Rep Still.
Leave.
Chair Maloney.
Here.
Rep Banta.
Leave.
Rep Cabell. Rep Devanzo.
Leave.
Rep Diorsi.
Here.
Rep Ecker.
Leave.
Rep Flick.
Here.
Rep Kuzma.
Leave.
Rep Labs. Rep Olsummer.
Here.
And Rep Wentling. We have a quorum.
Thank you. Mr. Director, you have submitted comments. We've all had a chance to look over those. We look forward to your testimony. And if you would introduce yourself and the gentlemen that are sitting with you, and then you may begin.
Sure. Thank you, Chairwoman Kulik. Good morning, Chairman Maloney, members of the committee. My name is Steve Smith, and I'm the new Executive Director of the Pennsylvania Game Commission. It's a privilege and an honor to represent the men and women of the Game Commission in this capacity. And over the next couple of weeks, I've had the opportunity to meet with several of you briefly over the next couple of weeks. I hope to meet as many as possible. I know how busy, obviously, of a time period this is for you, but I'll try to stop by and get to introduce myself and say hello and learn a little bit more about you and your districts and look for ways in which we can work together on behalf of wildlife and the sportsmen and women of the state. And just as an aside, one thing I'll be talking about as well is our new process that we're going to be implementing this year for selling antlerless licenses when they go on sale in 3 weeks. We've made some significant improvements to the system from last year, significant improvements on the process on how we're going to sell them. And at this point, we're just going to be looking for your help in getting the word out, because for the vast majority of our hunters, there won't be a rush where they won't need to be there buying licenses at the same time within the first day or two. We're going to hopefully spread out those sales so that things go a lot smoother. And again, would appreciate your help in getting the word out on how that process is going to be. But for today, happy to talk about the Auditor General's report from 2019 and the work that the Game Commission staff has done to implement the recommendations from that report. With me today are Dave Gustafson. He's our director of our Bureau of Habitat Management, and Dan Dunlap. He's the director of the Bureau of Administrative Services. I asked these individuals to be with me, given that a lot of the recommendations from the report directly relate to their program areas. So I asked that they come and collectively between the three of us, we'll try to answer any questions that you have. Certainly, if we're not able to answer anything today, we'll get back to the committee by the end of the week in writing with answers to any questions that you might have. To give some context, the report examined the Game Commission's operations from 2014 to 2017. And as you would expect, there's been a lot of staff turnover since that time period, and we've changed the way that we've done business and operated in a lot of different areas as well, many times in response to the report, and we'll talk about those. One of the documents that we provide a point-by-point synopsis of our changes that we've implemented since the report came out in 2019. You should have that document, and it is color-coded, so real quick. The black text is the Auditor General's recommendation at the time, or that the regular text is that, the first point. The black text is our response in 2019, and then the orange text underneath is our 2024 update. So we provide that point-by-point synopsis so you can really track our progress over the past 5 years on how we've done on each individual point. And just real quick, I wanted to commend the staff, the Game Commission staff that helped put this document together and did so quickly for the committee, especially with last week being a holiday. I appreciate their work to do this, and I hope the committee found it beneficial in preparing for today. So I'd just like to highlight a few of those items now, and then I'd be happy to take any questions that you have. First, a significant number of recommendations in the report, as I'm sure you've noticed, relate to the use of escrow accounts. So I'll explain what that is, generally speaking. Escrow accounts relate to a practice that was taking place at the time period of the audit, 2014, 2017. And that was when the Game Commission would enter into an agreement with a third party to do natural resource development on game lands. In a lot of instances, instead of taking that entire payment up front, the entire amount, and putting it into the game fund, the Game Commission, as well as the third party, would identify what we described as surface area damages to the game lands as a result of the natural resource development. And then we would set aside in that third-party escrow account replacement funds to make up for the loss of habitat and the loss of game land surface that was negatively impacted by that development. Once that money was set aside in an escrow account and the parties, the Game Commission and the third party, mutually agreed upon a tract of land that was for sale, that money was then used to purchase that land. And then the ownership of that land was then transferred back to the Game Commission. This was viewed as a way to efficiently make up for the loss of surface damage to the game lands as a result of natural resource development. As a result, largely, of the audit and the recommendations included in there, we have discontinued that practice and no longer maintain those third-party escrow accounts. Another significant area of recommendations in the report has to do with revenue collection and accounting procedures regarding payments made pursuant to natural gas development leases. There were several recommendations in the report that stressed the need for better controls to make sure the Commission was receiving the total amount that it was owed pursuant to those lease agreements. And I'm happy to report that we've made significant progress on that front as well, through increasing our staff, increasing resources, developing some new processes, and we've also just recently entered into an agreement with a consulting firm that specializes in conducting property analysis for government entities. And we've relied on their expertise to implement better practices to increase our assessments of game lands that have the potential for natural resource development. So all of these steps have been done to make sure that we're receiving the appropriate and correct payments and maximizing the opportunities for natural resource development on game lands. Because in turn, that means more funding for wildlife. And in addition, it helps us maintain our operations and keep the hunting license cost low. This way we don't need to go back to the sportsman and ask for an increase. The hunting license in Pennsylvania is already one of, if not the cheapest in the country, and we're proud of the fact that we've been able to maintain it at that level, and it's largely due to the natural resource development on game lands. One other area that I think is worth noting are the recommendations in number 10 and 11 for issue number 1. And these are recommendations that the Game Commission institute programs to increase the number of hunting licenses sold. I'm pleased to report that we've made significant progress on that front as well. And the reason those recommendations were included in the report was because at the time it was done, the Game Commission was on a steady downward decline as far as license sales. We had gone from about 940,000 general hunting licenses sold in 2014 to 850,000 sold in 2019. But since that time, license sales have generally, over that period since the audit, remained consistent. Again, at 850,000 in 2019 to 852,000 as of Friday for this year. So we think there's several reasons why that's taken place. Things like starting seasons on dates that allow for more participation, expanding hunting opportunities for a variety of species, increasing our marketing efforts, and making hunter-trapper education classes more convenient and more accessible. And I would also add that the General Assembly has helped significantly in this regard by passing a law to allow for 3 days of hunting to take place on Sundays. I think it's through the joint efforts of the legislature, this committee, as well as the commission, that we've been able to report and see significant progress on this front, which is critically important. And then finally, the last section that I'll highlight right now is issue area number 5, which related to the issuance of vehicles. So in preparing for this committee or for this hearing and doing our internal review, we've identified this as an area that potentially needs additional attention moving forward. The Commonwealth has set utilization standards that determine who is eligible to be assigned a permanent vehicle, meaning a vehicle that an employee can take home with them and then to their residence and then drive back and forth to their place of work. One thing that we'd like to do is just tighten up our process to make sure that the employees, and largely referring to non-law enforcement employees, I just want to make sure that's clear, but we want to make sure the employees who have been issued a permanent vehicle are meeting those utilization standards set by the Commonwealth through the Department of General Services. I fully expect that once we do this analysis, which is ongoing right now, I fully expect that once we've completed, we'll find that for the majority of our employees, they have met that threshold. The issue that we have is in preparing for this and doing our homework essentially is that we just don't have the justification yet. We don't have the documentation. So we've identified that as an issue area that needs improvement, and we're working on it right now to correct it. And I'd be happy to report back to the committee later on with the results of that. I think for now, those are the ones that I wanted to highlight. I certainly understand that there potentially be some questions, so I wanted to make sure there's an opportunity to do that. But thank you for your time, and look forward to, again, meeting with you and talking with you on this issue as well as any other issues that come up. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, we're going to now go to questions from our members. We will start with Representative Hohenstein.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Smith. I want to preface questions by just noting for you, I've been in conversation with one of the commissioners who handles Southeast, Todd Pride.
Okay.
And he had some very good things to say about you, and I do hope that despite the manner in which you had to assume this position, we are going to be able to find some good, strong common ground. My biggest focus in this is appropriate accounting for public funds. And I have to say I've been disturbed by the internal processes that have gotten us to this point. And again, no knock on you for being in this position. You're in a tough position. The manner in which you came forward and were immediately appointed with no discussion publicly, nothing happening publicly. That is something that's going to have to be addressed at some point, because it could very well be that you are absolutely the best person for this job, and you're going to be lauded for stepping into the gap and into the fire. But I'll tell you that in my 3+ years on this commission or on this committee, the Game Commission hasn't impressed me with its own internal procedures for how they communicate with us, and they need to do better, because I understand they're all technically volunteers, but a lot of the practices that I've been seeing coming from the commission really do concern me. And one of them does relate a little bit to what you just mentioned around the escrow accounts and getting third-party contractors. Because I know that there are some additional contracts, for instance, for lobbying that the commission has been engaged with that, again, I think need to be addressed. And I think the different contracts that the commission is making with outside parties, especially given the nature of your predecessor's departure, need to be very heavily addressed. So with that in mind, I actually want to focus on the revenue sources that are coming from the oil, gas, and mineral lease agreements, and the idea that we need to make sure that there are regular deadlines, regular reporting, that the reporting of the self-reporting of the oil and gas and mineral industry is actually confirmed, and how it's confirmed, and then that the processing of those payments are made appropriately. So I'm going to ask, we have a whole bunch of different written questions that probably need more in-depth answers that we can get into this hearing. But I think the example of some of the questions are, what are your internal control systems within PGC to monitor the royalty payments that come in? Who are the staff that are dedicated? You indicated you're increasing staff. We need to know who they are, what their qualifications are, and how much of their time is assigned to this specific issue of royalty payment remittance. And then how are we assured that the self-reporting from the industry is accurate? And is that done, again, on what time basis? Is that done monthly, weekly, quarterly, yearly, or all of the above, or some of the above? And what's done? Because it's that aspect that really will drive the rest of the inquiries, because the income that is received in that area has resulted in, from my understanding, funds that are in the hundreds of millions of dollars. And that is a lot of the public's money that seems to be behind a wall. And I'd like to break down that wall. So let me just see real quickly. The use. I have one further question on escrow, but I'd like to have you answer me first on these general questions on the processing of payments, and then I have a question on the escrow accounts.
Sure. Before I do so, if I could, I just wanted to touch on the issue that you brought up initially, increasing communications between the commission and the legislature, and this committee specifically. As I've mentioned, I've had a chance to talk to a few members, and that issue seems to be continually coming up, enough so that we've certainly identified it as priority number one, essentially, is to improve this relationship. And the chair both chairs have made that abundantly clear as well, of there needs to be more transparency and there needs to be more communication. So I'm completely committed to that. I've asked the chairs as well to hold me accountable to make sure it's taking place, to let me know if they see it's not, because we want to repair that relationship between the commission and the legislature. The Game Commission, our staff are doing great work. There's no doubt about it. We have some of the most dedicated, talented, devoted employees in the Commonwealth. They're doing amazing work on the ground. They're using the resources to benefit wildlife, to benefit sportsmen and women. So we just need to do a better job of making sure you're aware of that, seeing that it's taking place. Be glad to get you out into the field to see some of the work that they're doing, because it's an amazing thing. And I think anybody who cares about wildlife and cares about the future of hunting would be proud of it. So looking forward to having those conversations with you to increase your comfort level that we're using the money and using the resources that we have appropriately. And we welcome that. We welcome those discussions. So as to your specific questions, I'm going to ask Dave Gustafson to address some of them, knowing, and I think your point was well taken as well, some of them might lend themselves to written responses back to the committee, and we'll be sure to do that as well. But I think Dave can hit on a few of those highlights.
Thank you, Representative, for the question. I think, as Director Smith alluded to, since the time of this audit, we've had tremendous turnover within our team, and we have essentially an entirely new team in our oil and gas and mineral division now. We also currently have 2 vacant positions there that we're working hard to try to fill. One of them is a completely new position that we've created to be specifically working as an auditor and an accountant within that program area, to be 100% dedicated to this exact task. Since the audit in 2019, the initial person we added, probably about 80% of their time has been to this task. So I can review just a couple of the quick things we've done to talk about this, understanding that it is a massively complex environment when we talk about trying to track oil and gas revenues. And just by way of a little history, in the conventional gas development where a well hole was drilled straight down, it was pretty easy to know that if you had a well on your property and the gas that came out of that well that was straight down under your property, it was your gas, and you knew what you were owed on that. With the advent of unconventional horizontal drilling, and with our strategy in the Game Commission that we've undertaken to protect game lands by trying to have a lot of our development be non-surface development on the game lands, what you end up with is well bores that start somewhere else and potentially traverse numerous property ownerships by the time they get to the game lands, and then traverse through and under the game lands and onto another property owner. So when we look at the complexity of the reporting of that data, each one of those owners has a different decimal interest in the net revenue share that comes from that. They all may have different percentage royalties. You may have different partners with the gas companies themselves providing various portions of that revenue. So the complexity that has increased since the Marcellus Shale and horizontal drilling has worked its way toward the accounting side now. Just on the production side, it's massively complex, but on the accounting side, it's even more complex. But I'm happy to report the team we've got in place now, I think, is doing a tremendous job. We've engaged with a new commercially available software program called MineralSoft that the companies key data into that we can then review as well. So we get reports out of that software package that's new. We're learning every day about just how many tools are available within that package. We're cross-checking all of that data with the Department of Environmental Protection's well production reporting data. Just in the last few months, as Director Smith mentioned, we sent out an RFP and then engaged in a consulting contract with a firm out of Texas that specializes in these types of complex accountings. And we're happy to also say that we're using GIS technology now to look at each and every single well that occurs that the Game Commission gets royalty interests on, which as of today is 1,064 wells that we are receiving royalties on. So you can imagine the sheer volume of reports that we get from those wells. About 638 of those wells are non-conventional, meaning the horizontal, and that results in about 98% of our overall revenue. So 638 out of that 1,064 is what's generating the bulk of the revenue coming to the agency. We conduct now weekly deposits of checks that we receive every week. Sometimes multiple times a week if we're getting a high volume of checks. Sometimes in 1 week we may get 24 checks for wells. So our clerical staff conducts a deposit every week. We track all those checks. We've got this MineralSoft data that we can then attribute that money to each individual well, and then we can review the required royalty payment, do all the math calculations with our decimal interest that's required to really get down into the weeds and track down very accurately if we're receiving the correct payments for those wells. We do monthly reviews now of all of those things. We do periodic sample audits where we'll pull random checks and we'll have our staff dive in. The very few issues we found, we reach out to the operators and we say, hey, look, we think there's a discrepancy here in some sort of this data. They've been quick to respond. Our GIS tracking now, we have 97% of our well locations and their laterals fully into a GIS system, so that if we see a well payment missing for a well number within a month, we can very quickly jump in and look and see who do we have to contact, why did we miss a payment, was there a production reporting issue, and we've had very few of those. The ones that we have come up, we've caught, we've been able to work with the companies to get them resolved in a very timely manner. That's a summary, but as you can imagine, with that amount of complexity, there's a lot to it.
That's a good summary. I mean, I'm going to raise two things. One is speak to the DCNR if you haven't already, because I know they handle many of these same interactions and transactions. And two, again, not looking for the big answer right now, but what is being done to look backward to track any payments that should have been made, assessment of interest and penalties in spaces where payments weren't made, and also ensuring that accuracy really from, I guess, the previous audit period only covered up till 2017. So we've got 7 years that we need to make sure we're also accounting for. If you could summarize real quickly what's being done to sort of to cover that time period from the previous ending audit until now.
Yeah, so when we brought that additional staff member on, it was shortly after the audit report came out, and that first task was to kind of do that cleanup work, to go back and look and see what was missing, if anything. We did have several issues with companies that we did have to go back and clean up. It was a process, but we worked through it, and we believe that we got back to the place where everything was accounted for at that point.
All right. So I promised you a question on escrows. My big questions are, when did the practice of using escrow accounts end? And similar to what I just asked, what was done as those ended to ensure that they had been accurately kept or received as far as funding goes? And if we've ended escrows, to what general account are these all going to? And it sounded like there's some tracking as payments come in from particular suppliers that can be tracked and connected to particular wells. So you've got that. But is it all going into the same fund, or are there still separate funds, even if they might not necessarily be escrows? And who's got access to those?
So real quick, the use of escrows stopped pretty soon following the release of this audit. So it would have been fiscal year 2020. Is that correct, Dan? Right around the time period. Yeah, go ahead. So the money then went into the general fund or the game fund for the Game Commission at that time. Is that correct as well?
That is correct.
And then I think we can follow up specifically on your last question as far as what tracking, and we can give you the dollar amounts and what went in, and to show that how we made sure that was done properly.
Yeah, I would absolutely appreciate that. And Chair, understanding that everybody's got a lot of questions, I'm going to cede the floor for now, but I do look forward to having this being a continuing conversation and would encourage, I think, actually potentially a regular meeting, whether it's a publicly sunshine meeting, but at least a regular meeting with the chairs of this committee and yourself, Mr. Smith, and any essential staff.
Thank you. Rep. Haddock.
So you mentioned that you are using a new software called MineralSoft. When did that start?
I think that started in 2021.
So you're still calling it new and you're still learning the ins and outs of a system that you're using now for almost 3 years. That was your testimony. You don't know all the functions on the MineralSoft software.
Correct. There's still parts of it that enhancements that are parts of that software that we're working with folks to learn how to use, because at the same time that we started using that, our oil and gas mineral division chief retired shortly after, and we had to replace him. Our licensed professional geologist position retired or transferred to DEP, so we're still trying to backfill that slot as well. And we
So
had
there's nobody in the Game Commission that cross-trains and knows how to take another job over. Is that what you're saying?
No, that's not what I'm
Yeah,
saying.
I don't think we're saying that at all. I think it's just the normal gaps in knowledge when one staff person leaves and another comes on. So it's been, as Dave mentioned, and you would expect this if the audit looked at 2014 to 17, there's been turnover from time to time. It's just a normal part of business for us, and we're trying to maintain the continuation of operations during that time period.
Director Smith, that's about the sixth time I've heard you had changeover in openings. A business the size of the Game Commission should have people cross-trained and ready to rock and roll if somebody's on vacation, quits, gets fired, whatever. That's standard business when you're talking about people's money.
And I
And
think
it's about 6 times I've heard about openings.
I think the revenue has continued to come in during that time period. So obviously we're still maintaining, we're still been able to maximize royalties where it's possible to do so. Operations have been moving forward. And if I've given the impression that they haven't, that's my mistake, because they absolutely have been.
All right, well, there's 1,064 wells that you said you're dealing with. Just so that we're all clear, is that wells or legs to the wells? Are you talking about a well pad when you say 1,064, or are you talking the actual laterals that are under the ground?
1,064, that number would be the actual wells, not pads. And like I said, 638 of those are unconventional horizontal wells, and the remaining are old conventional vertical wells.
Okay. And you mentioned checks. Is the Game Commission still receiving physical checks instead of direct deposits?
We are, and the reason that we keep those coming in is because the information on those check stubs that come with all the production and deduction information is critical for us to be able to have available to do auditing work.
Are you
with.
aware that most of the drillers use a system called Energy Link, and most of that is available online, that you don't need a physical check?
Yes, we're aware and of most of our producers using Energy Link.
And you're not using Energy Link. You're still using physical checks that causes a delay. Possible checks get lost in the mail or not deposited in a timely fashion. So you can't even get a Game Commission to do a direct deposit. Is that the agency's stance?
I think our stance is we prefer the paper copy for accounting purposes.
Even though it's available online?
Correct.
So you're not good with technology? Is that what you're saying?
I think we're able to ensure that we have backup documentation for our own internal accounting practices when we use those paper checks. And when we cross-reference and run our monthly reports, we're able to use that documentation as backup if and when we find issues that we need to address with the operators. If all we had was the electronic data, it would make that a little more difficult for us to conduct
All
those
that
audits.
data is there. You're talking to a man that runs a business that deals with royalties. The escrow accounts, let's go back to that. So are all these escrow accounts completely closed and all money is transferred?
Yes, that's correct. We've discontinued that practice.
Okay. And what would be, so we talk about our royalties and using this new system. Do we know what our projection is this year as to what was budgeted on the gas and oil royalties received as to what was budgeted?
All those numbers? Damn.
I think originally we were at about, we estimated 130 million, but I think we're right now around 80 million.
Yeah, we're working on closing out the fiscal year numbers here pretty soon, but as of May 6th, we were at 77 million in royalty revenue, specifically from oil and gas. We had anticipated that number to be a little higher. The price of gas this year was lower than I think we anticipated, so.
And just a clarification, now we know there's a delay in payment. Are you accounting for the money when received or when actually earned? So is it on the deposit of your check? The check receipt is when you're booking the income?
Counting it as revenue when checks are received and deposited, yes.
Okay.
And as you mentioned, there can be a multiple month backlog as to when you receive a check in June, it may be for production that happened in April, if that's what you're alluding to.
Okay. And do we know what the balance in the general fund would be?
As of, I believe last week, it was at, the total amount in the game fund was at $506,697,000. 506,697,000.
6. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Representative. Rep. Deloso? And for everybody's information, I believe there's a meeting following us, so if we can get through any questions quickly so that the chair and I have an opportunity also.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll be brief. The recruitment and retention has become an issue. We've heard testimony in prior hearings that the Game Commission has stopped requiring Act 120 training because when we Act 120 train, our hirees tend to take their 120 cert and leave for, frankly, more money elsewhere. With roughly $500 million, how is this an issue? I mean, what do you perceive? Because, I mean, I know what I perceive. I perceive we are underpaying our game wardens. And that's going to be, I think, the general public perception. How is it that we come at a number where we are having a hard time with recruitment and retention with $500 million in reserve?
Sure, and that's a great question, and I absolutely appreciate it. The short answer is, as an independent agency, and I use that term independent loosely for the Game Commission, we still are required by law to follow the Commonwealth's procedures regarding classification and compensation. And what that means is our management team, me as an executive director, I have no ability to designate our officers and say that they'll reach this scale if the Office of Administration says they'll be at this scale. So we have to operate in terms of compensation for wardens and for all employees under the parameters that are set forth by the Commonwealth through the Office of Administration. And I believe it's Section 302 in Title 34 that says, for classification purposes, Game Commission employees shall be classified in accordance with the Commonwealth standards. So as great as our account is right now, and as much as I would love the flexibility to deal with this huge issue, and you're absolutely correct as far as holding on to the employees that we have. Again, not just law enforcement, although certainly law enforcement, but all of our employees. They're the lifeblood of the agency. You would think, and I would love to be in a situation where, as our budget grows, we can make adjustments accordingly. But that's not the parameters that we have to work with. I'd be happy to talk to you about potentially a fix to that.
You just took the words right out of my mouth. I would be happy to talk to you about a fix for that. Thank
Right.
you.
And I would add that I've mentioned the same to my counterpart, Tim Schaefer, and he jumped at it as well. So I'd be glad to have those conversations with you about just this idea about, is there a legislative fix to it?
Thank you.
And Rep. Delosa, we look forward to you carrying on that conversation with the director. Rep. Cerisi.
Thank you. I'm sorry I'm not in the room. I had to come back to my office. Two quick questions. One is, I'd like to know how often and how many members of the committee travel and for what purposes, at what the expense is. And the second thing you brought up, and this is a crawl on my side for a lot of people, and it's not just your committee, why they have to have a car they take home. Other than the wardens, why anyone else needs a car? Because we all use our own cars. People come to Harrisburg all the time with their own vehicle. Why are we giving cars out? What's the expense? Are these cars hybrids? How much are we paying in gas? How are we tracking the mileage? You know, these are all benefits that we're giving the staff, and I'd like to know more about that if you could answer that question.
Sure. And just to clarify your first question, you said travel and for what purposes? I assume,
Yes.
Do you mean regular business travel day to day or outside of that?
No, conventions, you know, when we leave the Commonwealth and we go to different things in other states, or, you know, how often that happens and what type of conventions that we attend.
Okay. And sure, we'll be happy to get you that information. To the second part of your question, individuals that have been assigned a vehicle, that was an area that was raised in the audit report, and as I mentioned in my testimony, that's something that I think we've identified internally while looking and preparing for today's hearing, that we could increase our internal controls to make sure that we're assigning vehicles appropriately and in a manner that's consistent with the Commonwealth standards. So I've asked all of our regional directors and all of our bureau directors to review the individuals in their chain of command who's been assigned a vehicle, and to ask for documentation to show that they're meeting the utilization standards set forth by the Commonwealth. So that review is ongoing right now.
How many vehicles, I'm sorry, do you think are out there right now? Roughly.
I'd be speculating. I can certainly get you the exact number here within the next day or two, because I don't want to put a number out there and have it incorrect. But again, we are going through that review right now. So the questions that you raised are exactly the ones that we're asking internally, and I'll be happy to share the complete results with you of that review that we're undergoing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Rep. Friel, do you have a quick question?
Yes, thank you very much. I'll make my question a request. In the recommendations for the issue area 4, and this has to do with the type of work you do to improve habitat and to acquire habitat, and you mentioned you put policies and procedures in place. Can you do two things? Can you put and share with us those SOPs, those policies specific to this committee? And could you issue a report as to how those funds have been used to improve habitat and delineate between private game lands and public game lands and the amount spent over each fiscal year?
Absolutely. We'd be glad to get you that information. Absolutely.
Thank you very
Again,
much.
to members of the committee, be glad. Also, would love the opportunity to show you some of the work that we're doing on the ground for habitat, because the Game Commission is doing incredible things. We have amazing staff, and we're using the resources that we've been able to acquire in the past couple of years, this windfall, essentially. We've been turning around and putting it into wildlife habitat. So be glad to show you this information and even give you a firsthand account of what we're doing.
Yeah, that'd be great. I just want to understand just how how it's done, what the procedures are, who makes those decisions, how they're evaluated, and then what actually has taken place over the years, so we can see that.
Okay.
That'd be great.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I want to welcome Representative Devanza and Representative Steele to the meeting. And Rep. Steele, do you have a quick question?
Yes, I do. I'm sorry, let me move over. First of all, thank you for the testimony. It was very informative. A couple of things that are really encouraging are, one, your response to Rep. Deloso's question. That's something that many members of this committee care a lot about, that your officers are fairly compensated. So excited to hear those conversations are moving forward. Two, it seems to me that the grasp that you have on your, what is a complex proposition, that oil and gas revenue seems to be good. You've got a four-pronged approach based on what you described: mineral soft, cross-checking with DEP, using GIS, and then also a paper trail. So that seems really good. Thank you for sharing that. $500 million is a whole lot of money. I was wondering if you could just spend a couple of minutes talking about the exciting ways that you plan to spend some of that money in the Commonwealth.
Sure. You're absolutely right. $500 million is a lot of money. When I started with the commission back in the early 2000s, I don't think anybody anticipated that we'd have this problem, and I use that term problem loosely. It's a good problem to have. It's probably the number one question I've received in taking on this role is, what are you going to do with all your money? I come to this position as a long-term Game Commission employee, and I think the benefit of my background and my experience is I've seen our agency go through peaks and valleys, I'll say, on the financial standpoint. We've had good years, often as a result of natural resource development, and then we've had lean years. And sometimes those lean years mean cutting programs, reducing staff, getting rid of positions, and not being able to do the work that we want to be able to accomplish. So my plan coming into this role, into this new role, and seeing that we're at a peak, at the highest point we've been, is how can we spend that money and use it wisely, invest it wisely, but do so in a way that sets us on a path for long-term financial stability. I'd love for us to be in a position where we can put together a 10-year plan, essentially, for spending that revenue, investing it in wildlife habitat, doing some of those things that I talked about, the capital improvements that we've been able to do for our employees, the resources we've been able to provide them. Some of the things that are really important to us is of course, our game lands, providing access. We've built roads, we've built bridges, we've improved culverts on streams. We've done a lot of things that we just hadn't been able to do in those low years where we were really short on finances. So we're going to put together a plan for our staff to, again, try to put out essentially a 10-year plan for spending this money, spending it wisely, investing it in those areas where it has the most impact. And then again, the other benefit, and I go back to, is this way we can keep our license fees low. If we can report back to our hunters that we've charted a path at the Game Commission where potentially we won't need to come and ask this body to increase those license fees over the next 10 years, and we can keep that fee at what is, I think, the lowest in the country, that's really good news for our hunters and for our trappers. And I think what that does for a lot of them is that lets them to continue in the sport, because a $20 hunting license, as long as it stays at that level, isn't an obstacle to continuing to buy it, continue to hunt, continuing to trap, continuing to invest in what we're trying to do. So that's, broadly speaking, that's our plan moving forward, making those investments that we have done and just continue to do so that they're benefiting wildlife and the sportsmen and women of the state. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I'll be more of a devil's advocate on some of these issues. And I know, Director, you know that you and I and you and myself and my good co-chair will have many conversations on a lot of these issues. I appreciate your answers to a lot of these questions. Unfortunately, we would need a whole day for everyone to sit and really do a thorough questioning and have a thorough understanding of what is going on. And these conversations will continue.
Understood.
I'm all about fiscal responsibility. I don't want to see every penny spent without thought. So I appreciate that you're looking at a 10-year plan. I hope we see that
Absolutely.
relatively soon. $500 million really is a significant amount of money that the majority of agencies in the Commonwealth could only dream about,
Right.
including your sister committee, the Fish and Boat Commission.
Absolutely.
So I know you all understand how significant this is to have this sort of money. I know it is not going to be a constant flow of money. We all know how the oil and gas industry works. So we appreciate, your thoughts on that. I have one, because most of my questions have been answered to a certain extent, but I have one specific issue. I think the elephant in the room, of course, is the changing of certain start dates for some of the, or at least one of the hunting seasons. And one of the things mentioned in the Auditor General's report was working on increasing license sales. For a long time now, I keep hearing that particular change, and of course we're talking about the change of the deer rifle season and when that starts, has increased sales. Yet today we're talking about basically flatline sales since that started. So in my mind, what I heard you say is basically that any of these changes, changing to a Saturday, adding Sundays, has really not done anything to change the license sales in Pennsylvania. Based on what you said today. And do you agree with that?
Well, first, I'll just say, Chairwoman, I was watching the clock and I was hoping we were going to make it through this whole hearing without bringing this up. So,
Oh, well.
I would say, in a perfect world, if you're doing an experiment, you only change one thing and then you can test it, see what happened, and you can say everything that resulted was a result of that one change. I mean, that's, the scientific process, that's how it worked. When it comes to hunting in Pennsylvania, we're not in a position where we can say the only thing that has changed in recent years is this or that. There's been a multitude of changes. We had the Saturday opener for deer season. We had Sunday hunting. We had increased opportunities for a variety of species. We had COVID as well, which brought a lot of individuals back into the sport, not just in Pennsylvania, but nationwide. So we had all those things happening over the time period since the board made that change. Now, what I can say that has happened is I wouldn't say that anything resulted in a substantial net increase in license sales, but I can say, and I think the data shows that what it did happen is it stopped the decline. For state fish and wildlife agencies across the country, we're in a position where stopping the decline is a victory. Like, we consider that to be a good metric of success, because what was happening previously is it was a pretty steady decline, going from about 940,000 general hunting license sales in 2014 to 850,000. That's cause for concern. That's a 5-alarm emergency to lose that many hunters over such a short period of time. Since that change went into effect, and again, that wasn't the only change. I want to be clear on that. There was a lot that happened during that time period. Since that change went into effect, we've gone from 850 to 852, with ups and downs along the way, generally speaking. So absolutely, I'm not in a position to say that as a result of that change, we saw a significant increase in sales, but I can say that the data would indicate since that change went into effect, the decline has certainly slowed and even stopped in some years.
And, I understand your argument. And you and I are in the same business. So we can look at all this and we can make our arguments. since being on this committee, I have been repeatedly told that these changes have increased sales. And what I'm hearing today is they really have not increased the sales.
I'd be hesitant to say anything directly resulted in anything else, just because there's been so many changes during that time period. I wouldn't make that statement, number one. And number two, again, no, I think even taking all those changes into effect, what you've seen is a downward slope and then a plateauing. There's been a plateauing since around the 2018, 2019 timeframe.
All right, thank you. I'm going to let the chair close us out. We have 5 minutes left. I'm going to hand it over to Chair Maloney, and then we will close out the meeting.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Very unfortunate that I'm limited to a 5-minute piece here, only because of the nature of this rooms and issues here. But I'm going to go over a few things, maybe for my colleagues' help, and what I'm going to ask publicly and basically state is that this is a good follow-up, something that didn't happen for 5 years, something that you folks didn't like that I initiated. And I have a lot of the text message and conversation that came from out of the agency, ridiculing Dave Maloney, because he wanted to know how the sportsmen were being served. So having said that, there's going to be a lot of follow-up questions that I'm going to highlight. I'm going to share with all my colleagues, and then we're going to expect answers. And I just want to hit on a couple things, especially since I heard some conversation today about the money. First and foremost, I want to make sure that the sportsmen in Pennsylvania and my colleagues sitting here know that this is an appropriation money grab bucket of money. This is sportsmen's funds. There's a point in which it's great that we have an independent agency as long as they're accountable. We're here today because the accountability has lacked. However, that money is not for some special program to take place that because suddenly the Game Commission is flush with cash, that we're now going to invent places to spend it. I will go back to when I was here 14 years ago on the issues of the sportsmen in Pennsylvania. And yes, to give you credit about different changes to seasons and such and opportunity, you're right. And for the most part, when it comes to whitetail deer, which is, as you know, 93% of the people in America pursue, Pennsylvania has been lacking because of what has taken place in an ideology within inside your agency. For anybody to believe that you have the deer population that you people purport to have is just untrue. The two gals that put together your numbers on the Saturday opener versus the Thanksgiving weekend completely undressed you people with your numbers. They're your numbers. You don't have the proof of antlerless successes, and you don't have the proof of how many people are actually hunting because of a change. In certain parts of the state, we're killing deer from September till now. You have proposed till the end of January. How many deer population people actually believe that math doesn't lie? You can't continue that parade and think that you're going to keep the population up. There are hot spots, we'll all agree. But I'm going to give you a proposal, something for you to think about. And we have talked about a lot of legislation and different things. I've been in contact with the governor's office. I don't get really great communication from that office. However, there are things that we have proposed about the salary increases, the fact that there's such a toxic environment inside of certain places within the Game Commission that shouldn't happen. And I'm not surprised that so many people have left. I do have conversation with a lot of people before some of you people were ever hired. So there is a great agency that I think has got off the tracks. And I think for 14 years of me, I'm just glad that we're having these conversations today because many of it has gone by the wayside and not listened to. Again, I will go back to the sportsmen, the habitat. I want to know if you guys think that you're going to put private land grant money from our funds as sportsmen on the private land. I want to know who it's going to and how much money you people intend to spend on it, when since the day I came here, we've talked about the habitat issues on our state game land. State game land should be priority number one. That is our land. I don't have a problem with us having more land. What I have a problem with is the verbiage having to do with who gets what and why the sportsmen at the end of the day aren't really the ones served. The turkey population has plummeted. The grouse, our state bird, as you know, for 14 years I've stated, is in trouble. We propose to put another predator on the ground. We have one from the own people of your folks that I know from up north to say, look, if anybody doesn't think that those fishers are killing turkeys, you just got some kind of blinder on. Your own previous predecessor sat right there and said that the only thing that they knew that they ate was each other. That's just so bad for sportsmen to have to hear. What we need is good, focused game management, not about who's going to get what money, where's it going to go. Let's stick to the mission of the Game Commission. I can't get past a day without getting an email or a phone call from somebody across the state of Pennsylvania having to do with issues within the agency. I don't get that with the Fish Commission. And quite frankly, if I do, it gets resolved. But I'll remind you that I have text messages and I have emails of the people who have resisted me from day one when I came in here. And some of you sitting there at that table know who you are. And this is what I'm going to tell you. It's about time we have light shined on an agency that should be providing for the sportsmen. I'd like to know, who was the company from Texas that you consulted with? What is that name?
Netherlands Sewell Associates Incorporated.
All right, thank you. I appreciate that. So I want to go back to another piece of game that has been a hot spot for a lot of people in Pennsylvania, and that's the pheasants. And what I'm going to want is, I'm going to want a report on the propagation areas that you folks have closed down and the DNA that we had as a game commission, to their credit, has created a pheasant that was more resistant for Pennsylvania and for our habitat that has been, from what I understand, no longer in existence and basically destroyed. So what I'd like to know is why we've closed those places down and what has happened with the genetic pheasant that was developed by Game Commission biologists to be a little bit more resistant, which brings me to the point of, with some of that money, with habitat and quality of deer, with the issue with the CWD, and for those of you that don't know it from this committee, that was another initiative of mine with the $1 million put in the budget, which was squandered. But why don't we think about the fact that there are biologists and people spending millions of dollars countrywide to develop CWD-resistant whitetail? What we should do, in my opinion, is put some of them on the landscape, buy them from those folks, let them breed with our does, and let's start creating our own whitetail CWD-resistant herd. I think it's a project that's worthy of a try, and something that you have other partners across the country willing to participate in. To me, these are projects that show our responsible help to the sportsmen moving forward, the next generation, all those things. I'll also remind you that with the hunter safety course legislation that took so long for me to pass here, you people were very, very lax in even acknowledging it or taking advantage of it, which to me is, if you don't continue to go after that next generation, you can sit here and make all these proposals all you want. But if we don't refeed that population of interested hunters, trappers, and fishermen and whatnot, all sportsmen, we're going to lose it. We have an opportunity. And my voice hasn't always been heard. I understand that. But I'm also going to tell you something. With the information that I have requested over the past and some of the things that have been blocked, it's been very disappointing, I'm going to say this on the record, that I got a report that when I asked about the outrageous spending at the Turkey Federation in Nashville, Tennessee, the directive was delete, delete, delete. And I'm going to tell you, it's so troubling to me that if I find out who participated in that and why, it will be in every newspaper across the state of Pennsylvania. If you don't want the people to know what you're actually doing, just keep that up, because I take offense to it. We are supposed to be served as sportsmen. And if you can't be transparent, then this meeting is worthless. That's what I'm asking. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. I'm sure we will have further meetings down the road, and I really hope that you do take the time to meet with all the members of this committee. With that, this meeting is adjourned. Thank you.